If you see on TV programs, YouTube, social media, and all the other garden-related media, a lot of people will tell you which plants are good or not good for wildlife. But one of the problems with all of these claims is that they're often completely untested. And they're quite easy to fall for. In fact, one of my most popular YouTube videos, I said I'm planting a wildflower meadow in order to help wildlife. And the reason why I thought this was a good idea was because somebody who I thought was knowledgeable said that it was a good idea. My point being that a lot of these things are completely anecdotal. That is, they're just stories passed from one person to another without anyone ever looking at why that might be the case or whether there's anything to support it. So in this video, I've collated a number of the different experiments that have been done in order to examine the impact of planting choice on wildlife in your garden specifically. And when I say your garden specifically, what I actually mean is in a garden setting rather than any other habitat. I once saw a YouTube video where somebody was saying about how good a plant lesser celandine is for wildlife. It flowers early in the year. There aren't that many other things flowering at this time, so if there are bees that are coming out, it's a fairly useful source of nectar for them. But if I could actually get rid of lesser celandine, then I would. The point is that I can't. It's a bit of a weed. But I wasn't really sure what to make of that, because even if I wanted to get rid of lesser celandine, I wouldn't be able to, because it's ridiculously successful, and that's why it's considered a weed most of the time. So in the bug study, which was the biodiversity in urban gardens in Sheffield, which I talked about in the previous videos, they decided to test two lists that had been independently put out saying that they had wildlife-friendly plants on the list. And the two lists, one was produced by the Countryside Council for Wales and the other was by Natural England. And they had 160 and 170 plants in them respectively, but only 45 in common. So immediately you would know that either one of the lists is wrong, or you would realise that the lists must be very incomplete. That's to say, there must be other plants that are wildlife friendly, but they just haven't made it to the list. If they are wildlife friendly, then you would expect that gardens with a high proportion of those plants would be better than gardens without them. And that really wasn't the case. There was no detectable difference in any of the types of pollinators that were found in the gardens with more or less of the plants from those lists. So this wasn't done on that many gardens because in order to detect flying insects, they would have to use malaise traps, which are like a big tent that you put up in the air and it catches flying insects. Because the malaise traps are expensive, they couldn't put them into loads of gardens, but you would still expect that if there was a strong effect, you'd have noticed it, and there was none. And the problem, I think, overall, with giving specific plants to put in your garden as better than others, I would say that it's almost impossible to make a complete list. With tens of thousands of plants in cultivation in Britain alone, it would be pretty likely that it would be an incredibly long list, far longer than you would be able to feasibly put into your garden anyway. That's not to say that there aren't plants that people don't grow enough of that are actually beneficial to specific insects or birds. It's just that to give a whole list, to say that that is the only way that you should plant your garden is just wrong. So let's drop the idea that your planting can be neatly optimized. There are lots of ways of tackling it. A commonly cited plant for any wildlife garden is often stinging nettles. In fact, I even suggested it in a TikTok video. That's because the red admiral, the comma, peacock and small tortoiseshells are all butterflies that exclusively lay their eggs, and their caterpillars exclusively eat nettles. So if you wanted some of those butterflies in your garden, it would then be suggested that you should have nettles in your garden because that's their main food source, or it's their only food source. But if you look at Jennifer Owen's garden, and Jennifer Owen was the person that did a 30-year-long study on her own garden and documented all of the plants and fauna that she found in it, she never found any of those caterpillars on the patches of nettles that she had in her garden. And so in order to investigate this, in the bug study, they put pots of nettles into people's gardens because nobody actually wanted them to be growing nettles in their gardens, because nettles are, for the vast majority of people, considered a weed. Because they grow all over the place and they smother everything else and they hurt when you touch them. So why would you want them in your garden? You can be pleased to know that they didn't find any of those caterpillars in any of the volunteer gardens where they put the pots of nettles in. So you can safely exclude nettles from your garden without any guilt, which you should feel fairly good about, because it didn't affect the number of adult butterflies that were found in the garden either. So if you want those butterflies in your garden, you're probably more interested in the butterflies than the caterpillars, even though they can't exist without one another, obviously. But the point is, if you want to see the beautiful butterflies, then the caterpillars are perfectly capable of feeding on nettles that are elsewhere, because it is a ridiculously common plant. So if it's not in your garden, there's still plenty of it around elsewhere. So I couldn't do a video like this unless I talked about native versus non-native plants in your garden and their impact on wildlife. Now, this is something that people get really heated about, and there are actually people that dedicate entire social media accounts just to this. And the justification for using native plants is always that because they've co-evolved with the fauna, they're the only ones that are going to be useful to the fauna, as though the fauna wasn't able to adapt to plants that are now here, that weren't here as they were evolving. But let's investigate some of the experiments that have been done in gardens specifically to figure out whether it's important to plant your garden with native plants or not. In Jennifer Owen's garden, she listed the plants that she found the greatest number of different species on. And of the top 10, 6 were not native and 4 were native. So it didn't really seem to be much of a correlation between whether a plant was good just based on its nativeness. And in the bug study, the gardens that had a greater proportion of native plants didn't show any positive correlation with the amount of wildlife that they found in them. And that's the variety and the number of species that they would find in those gardens overall. So to investigate this in a little bit more detail, the RHS at Wisley did the Plants for Bugs project, which you can find a link to below, where there's much more information, a whole list of the plants and the methods that they used for each of the papers that they published. This was led by entomologist Andy Salisbury. They made garden-like beds where they would grow different types of plants, and they separated them into a third of the beds would be devoted to native plants, a third of the beds would be devoted to near-native plants, that is, plants that are from the northern hemisphere but they're not native here, but they have a very close relative. So you might have Stachys byzantina, which is near-native, and Stachys officinalis, which is a native to the UK. And then in the final third, they would have exotic plants. So something from the southern hemisphere that has no close relatives in the UK. Verbena bonariensis is an example of this. The results were that in the native beds, they had the highest proportion of invertebrates. Then in the near-native, there were 10% fewer, and in the exotic beds, there were 20% fewer. But that doesn't mean that you should just plant your garden with native plants, because the plants from the other groups have useful characteristics too. Notably that the southern hemisphere plants often flower for much longer, so they can provide for pollinators for further into the year. And with climate change, that's becoming more important, that pollinators have a late food source as autumns get stretched out and stay warmer for longer. Overall, the presence of vegetation of any type provides for more invertebrates of all types. So the abundance and variety of vegetation is the most important thing that you can have. In reality, you don't have to plant your garden with anything from only one of those groups. You're more likely to mix it up, and the variety is what's going to give your garden value to wildlife, not just simply the group that you choose to predominantly plant your garden with. The overall message that they gave after this study was to plant your garden with a bias for native plants, but also include plants from the other groups because they have other useful characteristics and are uniquely valuable. And I think what's really important to mention about whether you tell people to plant their garden with native plants or not is that actually a lot of people do gardening to avoid such petty squabbles. Justifications like there's an insect apocalypse are not sufficient to tell people how they should plant their gardens. Gardens didn't cause that insect apocalypse, so they're probably not going to be the things that solve it, albeit they are useful to lots of invertebrates. But I think it's probably asking a bit much of gardens to think that they're going to reverse that process. And we would have to have some pretty significant evidence that changing the way that you plant your garden would help to reverse that process. And so far we don't have anything like that. So maybe just leave people alone and let them plant their garden how they like. It's far more damaging that people will have things like driveways and cut down trees than it would be that they don't have the plants that you think are the best for wildlife. And I'm pretty confident if you ask the vast majority of people, they're likely to be able to identify and name about 10 different plants. So this idea that people are then going to start prioritising one type of plant over all of the gardens across the UK is a pretty unlikely prospect. And there's lots of reasons why you might want to grow native plants for their specific horticultural interest. They might be the plants that interest you and you think that they're often overlooked, and that's fine. But suggesting that non-native plants have no value to wildlife is completely false. So even though I said that lists are often incomplete, if you do need a little bit of guidance, I've provided some. In the description there'll be some of the lists and I'll go through some of them now. Given that I mentioned that vegetation abundance is directly correlated with the amount of wildlife it can support, clearly using the vertical space by putting in trees is going to add significantly to the impact of planting on your garden for wildlife. The cheapest way to do this, like this hazel, is just it's self-seeded, so I just let it do its thing. Failing that, you can use whips, which are bare-rooted trees which you can get from the Woodland Trust, or you can get them from lots of different places, and you put them in the ground between about November to March, and they're considerably cheaper because they don't come with any soil attached. Failing that, you can just go and buy a potted plant from a garden centre. Generally, garden cultivars, i.e. plants that have been bred to be grown in gardens, are fine, but try to avoid overdoing some of the plants that have been bred in order to have no sexual parts. So double flowering varieties where the sexual organs have been replaced with more petals to make them more frilly. Obviously they don't have any pollen or nectar, so they're not great for pollinators. I mean, they still get eaten by slugs and snails, which does count as providing for fauna. But if you can provide one that also provides nectar and pollen, it's probably going to be better. Again, if you're looking to provide for pollinators, then not overdoing things like conifers, grasses and sedges and ferns is going to mean that you've got more flowering plants available for pollinators to use. And try to have things in flower for as long as possible. So you might have some Hellebores over the winter, Pulmonaria, Aubretia in the early spring, Mahonia late winter, and then Sedums and ivy into the autumn, as well as lots of other flowering plants that flower well into the autumn, like Rudbeckia and Verbena bonariensis that I mentioned earlier. Consideration of flower types and shapes, so plants from lots of different plant families, if you want to look those up and just check which plant family that you're putting in so that you know that you're providing a lot of different plant families. Also the shapes of the flowers are important too. So open and flat flowers like geraniums are good for beetles, as well as things like fennel, which is good for hoverflies, so that umbelliferous shape of the flower. Tubular flowers are good for bumblebees, so foxgloves and Antirrhinums. And things that are night scented like honeysuckle and nicotiana, which are the decorative nicotine plants that you can grow as summer annuals. So overall, generally plant what you like and enjoy the plants that you have in your garden, because they'll be providing for wildlife anyway. Just have the greatest range of them possible that you're prepared to have in your garden and that you like the look of. The problem with coming up with specific plants is that by including them, you necessarily have to exclude other ones. And you can't realistically have more than 200 plants or so in a normal sized garden, even if you really were trying to squeeze them in there. So even if you could come up with a complete list, you wouldn't be able to completely fill your garden with them, and it would vary depending on where you are in the country as to how useful it would be. Thanks again for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this series. I'll obviously make some other related videos to this sort of topic, but hopefully it makes you feel a little bit better that the results of studies that have been done on gardens have not concluded that you have to have a garden that looks like a nature reserve, or that you have to exclusively plant with native plants, or that you have to have a massive garden, or that you have to live in the countryside in order to have a garden that's good for wildlife. If you haven't already, then I'd absolutely love it if you were subscribed, because it makes a big difference to me and my channel. I know that you get asked this all the time by YouTubers, and I'm sure you're perfectly capable of deciding for yourself whether you wanted to subscribe. But I would like to ask you that favour. in order that you help me because I'm selfish.